The Soviets lost the moon race. That's the part you've heard. The part you haven't is that they buried the evidence so thoroughly that Walter Cronkite went on television in 1974 and announced the race had never happened. For 30 years, almost everyone agreed. They were all wrong. Behind a fence in Kazakhstan, in the dead of winter, the largest rocket the Soviet Union ever built was sitting on a launch pad. It was called the N1. It stood taller than a 30-story building. It had 30 engines clustered into the base of its first stage, more than any rocket before or since. It was designed to put a Soviet cosmonaut on the surface of the moon before Neil Armstrong got there. It failed. Then it failed twice more. And every time it failed, the Soviets pretended it had never existed. This is the story of what the Soviets were hiding on the moon. In May of 1961, John F. Kennedy stood in front of Congress and announced that the United States would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. At that point, the total amount of time any American had spent in space was about 15 minutes. The Soviets, who had already put the first satellite in orbit, the first animal in orbit, and the first human being in orbit, for 3 years, they did not respond. The Kremlin watched the Apollo program ramp up and decided it was a bluff. Khrushchev was preoccupied with missiles for the military. The civilian space program was a propaganda asset, and propaganda assets do not necessarily require moon rockets. By the time the Soviet leadership took the American challenge seriously, in August of 1964, the gap was already structural. The decree that finally authorized a Soviet-manned lunar landing was signed 2 months before Khrushchev was removed from power. The man tasked with carrying it out was Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of the Soviet space program, the same man who had launched Sputnik and Gagarin. He was already exhausted. He had less than 2 years to live. He did not know that yet. Korolev had wanted to build a heavy launch vehicle since 1956. His earliest sketches imagined something he called the super rocket, a 2,000-ton machine with 66 engines in its first stage and a nuclear-powered second stage. The nuclear plans were abandoned in 1959 when it became clear that conventional propellants could do almost the same job with far less risk. What survived was the configuration. A monoblock first stage, a cluster of medium-thrust engines, liquid oxygen and kerosene. By 1962, Korolev's design bureau had completed a draft project for a rocket they were now calling the N1. The design described in the draft project was a rocket with a liftoff mass of 2,000 tons, a payload of 75 tons to low Earth orbit, and 24 engines on its first stage. The official approval to build it came in September of that year. The first launch, the decree promised, would happen in 1965. It did not happen in 1966 either. The architecture Korolev eventually chose for the lunar mission was called the N1L3 complex. One enormous rocket would carry one cosmonaut to the surface of the moon. The Americans were planning 2. The Soviets could only afford 1. The single launch design assumed that everything would work. Every stage would fire. Every separation would happen on schedule. The lander, called the LK, had no seat inside it. The cosmonaut would stand at the controls during descent. There was no internal tunnel between the lander and the orbiter, the way Apollo had. To get from one ship to the other, the cosmonaut would have to go outside, in a spacesuit, and walk across the hull. None of this was reckless. It was just what fit on top of one rocket. The rocket was the problem. The N1 had been designed in a rush, on a budget that was always too small, by a man who hated the engineer who would have built him better engines. Korolev refused to work with Valentin Glushko, the country's top rocket engine designer, because Glushko had denounced him during Stalin's purges in 1938. Korolev had spent over a year in a labor camp in Kolyma, in the death mines, before being relocated to a prison for engineers. He never forgot it. So, When it came time to build the engines for his moon rocket, he turned to a man named Nikolai Kuznetsov, whose factory had spent the last 20 years building turboprop engines for bomber aircraft. Kuznetsov had never built a large rocket engine before. He agreed to try. The result was an engine called the NK-15. It was clever. It was efficient. It produced about 150 tons of thrust, and the N1 needed 30 of them, all firing at once, all synchronized, all of them never having been tested together in a full-scale ground test stand. There was no money to build one. The first time all 30 engines would fire together would be on the launch pad. Glushko had offered an alternative. He proposed using larger engines, fewer of them, burning a different fuel called nitrogen tetroxide and a kind of hydrazine. These were storable propellants, easier to handle, more reliable in some ways, but they were also toxic. They were corrosive, and they would have produced about 20% less performance than Korolev's chosen combination of liquid oxygen and kerosene. Korolev refused. Glushko, in retaliation, refused to develop a large kerosene engine for the N1. So Korolev went to Kuznetsov, who could not match Glushko's experience, and the rocket got smaller engines and more of them. The grudge was, in a literal sense, a design constraint. A small institute in the Soviet space industry called TS-NIMASH was assigned to calculate the probability that the first N1 launch would succeed. They looked at the failure record of every Soviet rocket and missile ever built. They ran the numbers. The probability of complete mission success came out to just over 1%. 1%. The man who ran TS-NIMASH, Yuri Mozhorin, knew he could not present that number to the Politburo. So he ordered his analysts to recalculate, this time excluding any failures caused by manufacturing defects or operator error. Only failures from previously unknown physics would count. The new number was 67%. He presented that one. The room went silent. Even with the massaged number, no rational engineer would launch a rocket with a 33% chance of catastrophic failure. The head of the flight control system, a man named Nikolai Pilyugin, was the first to speak. He suggested abandoning the statistical approach altogether. The only legitimate criterion for a launch decision, he argued, was the personal assurance of every chief designer that his system would work. The room agreed. Mozhorin agreed faster than anyone, since it meant his organization would no longer be on the hook if things went wrong. The decision to launch the N1 was, in the end, not a decision based on engineering. It was a decision based on a poll of men who could not afford to say no. There was no time. The Americans were coming. Apollo 8 had just gone around the moon. So they launched anyway. That brings us to February 21, 1969. Vehicle 3L, the first N1. It was 44 degrees below zero on the step. The wind was strong enough to knock a man over. The launch pad area had been evacuated. 50 railway tankers had filled the rocket with kerosene and liquid oxygen. The countdown reached zero, and the 30 engines of the first stage took 12 seconds to build up enough thrust to lift the vehicle off the pad. It rose into a clear blue sky on a column of fire and black smoke. Onlookers miles away heard a deafening roar that took several seconds to subside. About a minute later, the engines went dark. The rocket continued to climb briefly on momentum alone, and then it began to fall. A faraway flash confirmed the impact. It crashed 52 kilometers from the pad in the snow. The investigation took 3 months. What they found was this. About 6 seconds after liftoff, a small pressure-measuring pipe inside engine number 2 had broken off because of high-frequency vibration. About 25 seconds after liftoff, a fuel pipe broke off the same engine, spewing kerosene into the rocket's interior. Hot gas met leaking fuel. A fire started in the tail compartment of the rocket about 55 seconds after liftoff. The fire melted the insulation on the wiring of the engine control system, called KORD, which was a kind of automated supervisor that monitored all 30 engines for signs of trouble. The melted wiring sent false signals into cord circuitry. KORD interpreted these signals as a catastrophic failure of every engine on the rocket and shut all of them down at once, 68.7 seconds into the flight. The rocket had not actually failed. The fire had killed the system that was supposed to save it. Worse, the same shutdown signal traveled up to the second and third stages, leaving the entire vehicle paralyzed. The British picked up the launch attempt through their intelligence networks. The Americans, who had spy satellites watching the launch site, somehow missed it. For years afterward, the CIA insisted the launch had never happened. The Soviets, of course, said nothing. The pre-launch press release plan, drawn up weeks earlier by a propaganda official named Yuri Mozhorin, had 3 different versions ready for 3 different outcomes. None of them mentioned the moon. The official policy of the Soviet Union was that there was no moon program. There never had been. The N1 was, depending on which version of the press release you read, a research vehicle, a heavy science satellite, or simply not a thing that existed. Now let's come back to what they buried, because the second one is the moment everything ended. By the spring of 1969, the schedule was in tatters. Korolev had been dead for 3 years. He had died in January of 1966 on an operating table in Moscow during what was supposed to be routine surgery for a polyp in his colon. The surgeon, the Minister of Health himself, found that the polyp was actually a tumor. The operation lasted 5 hours. Korolev's body, scarred from years in the labor camps, did not survive it. He was 59 years old. His replacement, Vasily Mishin, was a competent engineer but had none of Korolev's political instincts. Mishin could not motivate the workforce the way Korolev had. He could not extract resources from the state the way Korolev had. He could not, when the moment came, persuade the leadership to keep funding a program that everyone knew was losing. The Americans had just flown Apollo 9, testing the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 was about to fly, taking the lunar module to within 15 kilometers of the lunar surface. Apollo 11 was scheduled for the summer. The Soviets had one card left to play. If they could launch the second N1 in early July, they could send an unmanned craft on a loop around the moon and bring it home. At the same time, a smaller robot probe called Luna 15 would be launched on a Proton rocket to land on the moon, scoop up some lunar soil, and return it to Earth before the Americans got back. It would not be a manned landing, but it would steal a little of the moment. It might let the Soviets claim, with a straight face, that they had never been racing for the moon at all, that the whole thing was a Western fantasy. Vehicle 5L was rolled out to the same launch pad in late June. It carried a modified spacecraft, a mock-up of the lander, and a working escape tower at the top. The launch was set for the night of July 3, 1969, 2 weeks before Apollo 11. The engineers were optimistic. They had moved the cord system out of the engine compartment, where it had been vulnerable to fire, into the safer intertank section. They had added ventilation openings to the engine compartment to keep it cooler. They had installed filters to prevent metal debris from entering the turbopumps. The modifications had been made in a hurry, often using marked-up engineering sketches rather than completed drawings. 3 shifts of workers, around the clock, for months. What happened next was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever recorded. The rocket lifted off normally at first. Then, a quarter of a second after the engines reached full thrust, the oxidizer pump on engine number 8 ingested a small piece of metallic debris and exploded. A fire began at the base of the rocket as it rose past the top of the launch tower. KORD reacted, this time correctly, and began shutting down engines in pairs. The thrust dropped below the weight of the vehicle. The rocket leveled off, briefly. Then it began to fall back toward the pad, tilted at about 45 degrees. The escape tower at the top fired and pulled the empty crew capsule away to safety. The rest of the vehicle, full of liquid oxygen and kerosene, hit the launch complex. The explosion was visible from the horizon. Witnesses described it as comparable to a small nuclear detonation. The shockwave shattered windows kilometers away. The launch pad, which had taken years to build, was reduced to a crater. American weather satellites and reconnaissance satellites picked up the disaster within hours. The damage to the launch complex was so severe that it would take 18 months to repair. The Soviet program, in that single instant, was effectively over. 3 weeks later, on July 20, 1969, Apollo 11 landed in the Sea of Tranquility. At almost the same moment, while Armstrong and Aldrin were on the lunar surface, Lunar 15, the small robot probe the Soviets had launched as a desperate parallel mission, attempted its own descent. It crashed into a region of the moon called the Sea of Crises. The metaphor was so perfect that no novelist would have dared write it. The Soviets said nothing. Officially, Lunar 15 had been a routine science mission. Officially, the N1 did not exist. The pad on which 5L had exploded was concealed from satellite photography as best as it could be. The footage of the explosion was classified. The records of the program were sealed. This is the part that takes a moment to absorb. Walter Cronkite, in 1974, told American audiences that the Russians had never been in the moon race at all. The London Sunday Times said the same thing in 1971. The New York Times had said it in 1964. By 1989, NBC News was producing anniversary specials narrated by Leonard Nimoy that flatly stated the space race had not been a race. None of these journalists were lying. They did not know what had happened in the steppes of Kazakhstan. The Soviets had buried the footage so completely that the Americans, who had won, started to doubt that there had ever been a contest. A standard Western narrative settled in by the mid-70s. The one that said the Soviets had lost interest in the moon by 1963, that the race was a bureaucratic invention by NASA to pry money out of Congress, that the whole thing had been theater. The reality was the opposite. The Soviets had been working as hard as they could. They had been failing in private, on a scale and at a cost that would have stopped any open program in its tracks. And they had been lying about it, consistently, for years. What makes the N1 program strange is not that it failed. Lots of rockets fail. What makes it strange is the specific texture of how it failed. Compare it, briefly, to its American counterpart. The Saturn V, which carried Apollo 11 to the moon, was built by NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center under the direction of Wernher von Braun. It used 5 F1 engines in its first stage. Each one produced about 700 tons of thrust. There were 5 of them, total. 32 Saturn rockets of various types were launched during the program. Not one of them failed catastrophically. The contrast with the N1 is almost surgical. The Americans built 5 large engines, tested them exhaustively on the ground, and trusted them. The Soviets built 30 smaller engines, never tested them all together, and prayed. The Americans had something else too. They had a single coordinating organization called NASA, with one administrator, with one chain of command, with one budget. The Soviets had 4 competing design bureaus run by 4 men who hated each other: Korolev, Glushko, Mikhail Yangel, and Vladimir Chelomey. Each one wanted to build the moon rocket. Each one had political patrons in different corners of the Soviet government. Each one, at various points, proposed alternative designs that would have replaced the others. Yangel proposed a rocket called the R-56. Chelomey proposed a rocket called the UR-700. Both of these were, in the standard analysis, more conservative designs than the N1. Both used clustered rocket modules that could be shipped by rail and assembled at the launch site. Both used Glushko's storable propellants. Neither was ever built. The Soviet space program spent years in a kind of slow-motion civil war between its chief designers, and the war was settled, again and again, not by engineering analysis but by political maneuvering. In August of 1964, the year Korolev was given the lunar landing assignment, 3 different rockets were under serious consideration for the same mission. By the time the N1 was finally chosen, the Americans had already started bending metal on the Saturn V. The Soviet engineers were not stupid. They were working with less money, less time, less political support, and a chief designer who refused to talk to the country's best engine builder because of a 30-year-old grudge. They were also working in a culture where bad news was politically dangerous. The man who calculated that the first N1 had a 1% chance of success was told to find a way to make the number look better. He did. The number was a fiction, and everyone in the room knew it was a fiction, and they launched anyway. This is what the Soviets buried, not the explosion. The reasoning that produced the explosion. There were 2 more launches after 5L. The third came in June of 1971, Vehicle 6L. The rocket had been substantially redesigned, with filters in the propellant lines, modified tail aerodynamics, and an all-white paint scheme to keep the engine compartment cooler in the summer heat. It also had a new evasive maneuver programmed into its trajectory, designed to push it away from the launch pad immediately after liftoff to prevent another 5L-type catastrophe. The maneuver worked too well. As the rocket cleared the tower and began its programmed roll, the gas dynamics of 30 engine exhausts interacting with the slipstream produced an axial spin that the control system could not compensate for. The rocket developed an uncontrollable roll. About 50 seconds into the flight, as it passed through the region of maximum aerodynamic stress, it began to break up. The range safety officers destroyed it a moment later. The 4th and final launch came in November of 1972, Vehicle 7L. By then, the engineers had improved the boat tail design, added high-thrust roll engines for steering, and replaced the entire telemetry system. The launch went well at first. The rocket flew for 107 seconds, almost reaching the moment of first-stage separation. Then, a programmed shutdown of 6 central engines, intended to reduce stress on the vehicle structure, caused a hydraulic hammer in the propellant lines. A fuel line ruptured. The oxidizer pump on engine number 4 exploded. The rocket disintegrated in mid-air. Investigators argued, afterward, about who was at fault. Mission blamed the engine designers. The engine designers blamed the propellant lines. Everyone agreed that if the central engines had simply not been shut down, the first stage might have completed its burn. By the time 7L exploded, Apollo 17 had already left the moon. The race was not just over. It had been over for 3 years. 2 more N1 rockets, vehicles 8L and 9L, were fully assembled and ready to fly. They were never launched. Their improved engines, the redesigned NK-33 and NK-43 series, had completed extensive ground testing. The engineers believed, with some justification, that the next launch would have succeeded. They never got to find out. In May of 1974, Mishin was removed from his post and replaced by Valentin Glushko, the same engine designer Korolev had refused to work with. Glushko cancelled the entire program. The 2 completed rockets were dismantled. The fuel tanks were used as carports and storage sheds at the Cosmodrome. The payload shrouds were repurposed as sunshades for picnic areas. By every account, the cancellation was political as much as technical. Glushko had spent 15 years opposing the N1. Given control of the bureau that had built it, he was not going to defend it. But there were 150 engines in a warehouse, engines that Kuznetsov's factory had built for the cancelled program. The order from Glushko was to destroy them. Kuznetsov did not destroy them. He had spent his career on those engines. He had nothing else to show for it. He sealed the warehouse and walked away. Now let's come back to those engines, because they have one more piece of the story to tell. 20 years later, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, an American aerospace company called Aerojet bought a batch of those warehoused N1 engines. They were redesignated AJ-26. They were tested in American facilities. They worked. They were considered for use on several American rockets, including a launch vehicle called the Antares. The engines from the buried program, the engines that had supposedly never existed, ended up flying on American rockets in the 21st century. There was at least one test stand explosion during their American service, and at least one in-flight failure traced to engine components, although the precise cause is contested in the technical literature. The point is not the failure rate. The point is that the engines worked at all. They had been designed in the 1960s by a man who had never built a large rocket engine before, for a program his country denied existed. And 40 years later, they were still flying. There are things we still do not know about the N1 program, and we may never know them. We do not know how many people died building those rockets, or working at the launch complex, or living downwind of the propellant fueling stations. The accident records were classified, and many of them have not been declassified. We do not know whether Vehicle 8L, which was assembled and ready to fly when the program was cancelled, would have worked. The improved engines that were installed on it had completed their ground testing. The detailed redesign of the rocket was finished. Several of the engineers who worked on it believed, until the end of their lives, that the next launch would have succeeded. We do not know whether they were right. We do not know whether, if they had been right, it would have changed anything. The Americans had already won. Whether the second-place finisher came in 3 years later or 5 years later was not the kind of distinction history tends to remember. We also do not know, in any complete sense, what the cosmonauts who trained for the lunar landing were told. Several of them, including Alexei Leonov, the first man to walk in space, had been selected for the mission. They trained on simulators of the LK lander. They flew helicopters that simulated the lander's descent profile. They studied lunar geology. They were promised, year after year, that the next launch would be the one. The training group was officially dissolved in October of 1973. None of the men in it ever went to the moon. Some of them spoke about it later, in interviews after the Soviet collapse, but most of what they said was guarded. They had spent a decade preparing for a mission that, as far as the rest of the world knew, had never been planned. What is left of the N1 program today is mostly silence. The launch complexes at Baikonur are crumbling. The roof of the assembly building has caved in. The apartment blocks where the workers lived are empty. Tumbleweeds grow among the abandoned components at the Cosmodrome's old recreation area. A few of the engines are in museums. A few are in private collections. A handful of LK lander prototypes survive, scattered across Russia, in technology centers and aviation institutes, and a museum at the Moscow Aviation Institute. They are small spacecraft, about 5 meters tall, designed to carry one man. None of them ever flew with a person inside. The film footage of the 4 launches, which the Soviets classified for 30 years, was finally released in the late 80s. It is grainy, it is silent. It shows a very large rocket rising into a very clear sky and then falling back down 4 separate times, across 4 separate years, in a country that no longer exists. There is something specific about watching it now. The rockets in the footage do not know they are about to fail. They rise with the same confidence as any successful rocket. The flames at their bases are bright. The smoke trails are clean. For the first 60 seconds, or 50 seconds, or 107 seconds, you cannot tell the difference between a rocket that is going to the moon and a rocket that is going to disintegrate. That, in some way, is what the Soviets were burying, not the failures themselves. The fact that the failures had been, until the last moment, indistinguishable from success. The Sea of Tranquility is a real place on the moon. The Sea of Crises is a real place on the moon. They are about 1,000 kilometers apart. Apollo 11 landed in one of them, Lunar 15 crashed into the other. They are still there.